Anin, and good evening, everyone. We're just getting our video settled, but it's good to see so many participants here for our esteemed guest and colleague, Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley, to talk about chronic disease and mental health. And I'm excited to share this opportunity with all of you. And there I am. Anin, Graham Reed, Nadежda Kaz, Ottawa, Nonjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dow. Graham Reed, the interim president of the Canadian Spondylitis Association. Very excited to be coming to you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa, and excited to share this next hour with you in this virtual circle, talking about something that I think we're all quite seized with as we continue to navigate this global health pandemic, recognizing as it's changing our daily experiences. Tonight, I'm going to share a quick presentation about the CSA and then turn it over for our guests to share more about chronic disease distress and mental health. But before that, I do that, just a few kind of housekeeping pieces. We will mute your mics, so just to be cognizant of that. And then we'd actually ask folks if when you have questions, you could put them in the question and answer button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that will enable us to see which questions are being asked and how we can respond to those. We are recording this, and as we have done in the past, we will post this up on our website, spondylitis.ca, and we'll be able to share this massive amount of resources that we've compiled to support those living with spondyloarthritis as they navigate different uncertainties, including the uncertainty of COVID, and have a number of different resources on there to share with all of you. We're also, just while I have the floor, sharing an update on COVID next Tuesday. So that is May 19th, around the same time. And we'll have several medical experts sharing, and would encourage folks to join in with that as well, as we continue to figure out what's the best way that we can support people living with spondyloarthritis. So with that, I might jump into the presentation quickly and then turn it over to Dr. Lee-Baggley. Want to just appreciate our different sponsors that support the work that we do as a patient-led organization. And as we share resources that are usable like this, we can continue to draw on their support that we're very appreciative of. So today, as I mentioned, I'll provide a brief overview of the CSA. We'll open up space for our presentations, and then have an extended question and answer period. But before we do that, just talking a little bit about who we are as the Canadian Spondylitis Association. We are the national association with the sole purpose to support those living with spondyloarthritic diseases. We're a not-for-profit corporation. We have, at this moment in time, 7 board members, all of which live with one or another condition of spondyloarthritis. Many also live with others. I myself live with ankylosing spondylitis and Crohn's disease. And that gives us a very unique patient-centric perspective that we bring to all of our activities. We also have an executive director, Wendy, who's on the line, and we're appreciative of all the work that Wendy, and also our social media specialist, Dan, who is cultivating this webinar and bringing it to all of you. And then we also have international partners. So recently we embarked, within the last 6 months, it feels much longer, but on a process to kind of reorient our vision and our mission. And we're aspiring to be that leading voice for those living the spondyloarthritis community, providing support, education, awareness, and advocacy. And we have recently shared our 3-year strategic plan on our website, and would encourage folks to check that out if you're interested to see what we're planning to do for the next 3 years, and continue to bring resources such as this to those living with spondyloarthritis. We have those 4 strategic pillars that I mentioned, and I won't get into too much detail about them. One of the things that obviously we spend a lot of time on is awareness, building it through our different social media networks, supporting patients through support groups, important peer-to-peer exchange opportunities, and then also the development of materials, and many of which will be found on our website. We also do work for advocacy and research, especially now. A lot of emphasis has been on the question of how to appropriately deal with COVID and with respect to those living with spondyloarthritis and the realities of potentially being immunocompromised. And then the other broader, longer term discussions that we're engaged with, including biosimilars and others. One of our bread and butter type of offering is our support groups. When I originally joined the CSA, I would say about 4 years ago, we started with 2. We're now up to 13 from all across the country. And we're also looking to launch them virtually. And so right now we have a call open for a pilot project of kind of virtual support group sessions on the 23rd of May, and 2 weeks after that in early June. We at the Ottawa support group had a very successful virtual session, and just an opportunity to share with other folks living with spondyloarthritis, and now we're testing that out at a national scale. So a lot going on, and we look forward to continuing that. So are very encouraged with the number of participants. I see over 80 that have tuned in for this session now. And so that's a broad overview of the CSA, and happy to follow up. Both my email and Wendy's email are there in case there are any questions or areas of interest, or whether you also want to get involved with the CSA. Definitely reach out to either of us with that regard. So that's it for me. I will now turn it over to our esteemed guest, and look forward to her presentation. So I'll stop sharing and then let you share.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Okay, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Sound is okay? Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley. I'm a registered psychologist. I'm going to be talking today about chronic disease and mental health. So I currently work for the Nova Scotia Health Authority, which is one of the tertiary level hospitals in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I typically work in cancer care, as well as with other groups with disease, including liver disease and kidney disease, diabetes, obesity, so a whole range of things, including chronic pain. I also do research with Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University, and I run the Behavior Change Research Institute, which is a research institute where we do work on behavior change in chronic disease. And that includes behavior change for patients, but also behavior change for healthcare providers, and training healthcare providers to be better at supporting chronic disease self-management. I'm currently, during the pandemic, I've been redeployed to provide therapy for first responders, medical first responders of the shootings in Nova Scotia, as well as for frontline providers during the COVID pandemic. These are my speaker disclosures, and none of them had any influence over the talk today. Okay, so first I'm just going to talk about chronic disease distress. So lots of people, have heard things about anxiety, depression, those kinds of issues. And I'm going to suggest that there is this sort of continuum of distress. And at a certain point, this stress kind of interferes with functioning. And there's also sort of this line at which we designate some of this distress to be a psychiatric condition. However, and we know that that is higher in groups who have chronic disease. So for example, depression, the rates in the general population are about 6%, but they're almost double that in populations with chronic disease. But I'm also going to suggest that there is another level of distress, which is chronic disease distress. And that's actually much more prevalent in people who have chronic disease. And chronic disease distress is distress about your illness. So it's symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, irritability, fatigue that are related to the chronic disease. That if somehow magically you could get rid of the chronic disease, that you probably wouldn't have these mental health symptoms. And that's somewhat different than, a psychiatric condition of like major depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, because these symptoms are prompted by having to live with a chronic disease, which we know is stressful. And the importance of this is one, that it's a lot more common. Many people who have a chronic disease are going to experience this kind of distress, but you also would want to treat it a bit differently, because you'd want to provide interventions that acknowledge this ongoing stressor of the chronic disease that can't be fixed and can't be removed. And that's not necessarily something that would be addressed in a standard intervention for major depressive disorder or anxiety disorders. They won't necessarily address the chronic disease distress. And so we think this is an important concept for both people with lived experience as well as healthcare providers to understand that we can screen for symptoms of depression and anxiety, but that doesn't mean it's a major mental illness. It may also reflect this chronic disease distress. So this is a self-report scale that we've adapted to measure chronic disease distress, and you'll see some of the items. Feeling that my chronic condition is taking up too much of my mental and physical energy every day, feeling my healthcare providers don't know enough about my chronic condition, feeling angry, scared, or depressed when I think about living with my chronic condition. And we know that there are measures like this in a variety of different chronic disease populations, including diabetes, cancer-related distress. And so we know this happens across different chronic diseases. And this chronic disease distress breaks down into these different domains, which is the emotional burden of having a chronic disease, which again are these symptoms of anger, frustration, irritability, depression, anxiety around the impact of the chronic disease on a person's life. The regimen distress, so the kinds of things that people have to do to manage their chronic disease. Patient provider distress, so having challenges with your healthcare providers. And then social support distress, which is that sometimes our friends and families don't understand what it's like to live with a chronic disease and may do things inadvertently that are not very helpful if you're living with a chronic disease. Okay, so I think it would be, inexcusable to do a talk about mental health and to not address COVID. So I think it's really important to distinguish this idea of chronic disease distress as well as like a major mental health disorder. I also wanted to spend the majority of the time talking about how to cope with COVID, because this is something that we're all facing and it's really important to talk about. So I have some tips here about how to cope with the current pandemic. And the first one is, it's okay to feel how you feel, which, I think it's helpful to understand why we're feeling the way we are during this pandemic. And part of this relates to how our brain works. And so this is our caveman brain or survival brain. That's where our emotions come from. So that's where anxiety comes from. That's where fear comes from. And this brain is built for survival, gives you awesome advice if you were a cave person and your life expectancy is 30, but does not always give us great advice for our modern world. And it functions automatically. You cannot turn off your survival brain. You can't turn it on, turn it off. The other part of our brain is our frontal lobes, which controls our behavior. And so this is for starting behavior, stopping behavior, planning, delaying gratification. This is like how we get through our day. This is where willpower comes from. This is where self-control comes from. It's from our frontal lobes. But unlike our caveman brain that's working all the time, our frontal lobe is like a battery. And so it gets drained as we go through our day and use it up as we control our behavior throughout our day. And in this current pandemic, our caveman brains are on fire and our frontal lobes batteries are incredibly spent. So our caveman brains are on fire because there is this threat. There's this threat that is out there that we know exists, that we know has an impact on people that can be life-threatening for some individuals. And so that our caveman brains are on fire in perceiving this threat. Our frontal lobes are also exhausted because it takes an enormous amount of energy to get through a COVID day, right? So if you think about the basic task of going grocery shopping and how much more effort that takes now in COVID living compared to like pre-COVID living, right? So you have to like know when you're supposed to go, and you're probably gonna have to wait in line and monitor your distance from other people at all times and follow the arrows along on the, on the floors to go the right direction. That takes an incredible amount of frontal lobe. And that's like a basic task of grocery shopping. Our entire day is filled now with things that tax our frontal lobe. And this is why, I hear people saying like, I haven't done anything, but I'm exhausted. You have done a lot, because it takes an enormous amount of energy just to get through a COVID day. It takes an enormous amount of energy to deal with that caveman brain that's on fire. Okay, so you may find that you are more anxious lately, and this would be really understandable, right? People who have an underlying health condition feel at risk, having to wait longer between appointments, or some treatments or interventions that have been delayed or put off, worrying about whether you're going to get your test results back on time. And some people wondering, should I go to emergency and get care? Having symptoms of a heart attack or a stroke, you absolutely should. And yet we know people are not going to the emergency room as often as they should, probably because they're afraid, potentially of the virus being in the hospital or of taking up resources from COVID patients. But you also might feel less anxious. So I've had a number of like patients and friends talk about actually feeling better during some of like the lockdowns. So I had a patient who had an anxiety disorder, and he said, I feel great. Like everyone's as anxious as me now, so I feel really normal, right? Another one of my patients who has a very serious chronic disease, she said, I feel better because the world has slowed down and I don't feel like I'm missing out on as much. And another friend who has a chronic disease who said, I feel like people are finally understanding what it's like for me to deal with my chronic disease every day, because she was always worrying about infection. She was always having to monitor her health. And so she felt like people might understand her better. And so this tip about it's okay to feel how you feel. These feelings come from our caveman brain and we have no control over them. Right? So I also think it's helpful to think about this as like being in a war. And it's really psychologically like being in the London Blitz, because we are being bombarded by a threat that we can't control. We don't know when it's going to stop. We don't know when it's going to hit us. And even as we talk about reopening across the country, it's not like we have a peace treaty, right? It is totally understandable to feel anxious about reopening, because we're not going back to normal. It actually is going to be a new set of behaviors that again is going to tax our frontal lobe as we figure out this new normal. And so psychologically, this is like being in an active war zone. And if it actually was, a war zone and there were buildings collapsed around us, we would understand why we were feeling anxious. We would understand why we're not sleeping well or why we feel off, right? Because we understand what that means to be in a war. We don't really have great understandings of what it means to be in a pandemic. And so because our frontal lobes are spent, we are all using our default coping strategies, which may not be our best version of coping strategies. So people who have anxiety disorders and depression, eating disorders, all these things that might have been stable, it's quite likely that they're actually like coming out again, and that these things that are stable are a problem again. And that's because our frontal lobes are spent and we don't have enough energy to cope better. And so our goal here about feelings is really to try to stop fighting our feelings, that it's okay to feel how you feel. And if you think about, feelings sometimes are like waves. We have had to talk a lot about grief out here in Nova Scotia and across the country because of the shootings. And grief is like a wave. It will just sort of hit you. And you can either try to swim upstream or you can ride that wave to shore, which means that you just let yourself feel sad. You have a good cry. You're likely to feel better afterwards, right? It's actually quite exhausting to try to fight our feelings. So our goal here is that it's okay to feel how we feel. And chances are you're going to feel pretty off. Why? Because it's the London Blitz. So there's often this great duality in our feelings, right? We can both feel sad about what's going on in the world and recognize, and be grateful for the things that we have. We can feel sad and anxious, and we can find moments of joy. So it's okay to feel how you feel, and these, we're gonna feel different things at different times, and sometimes different things at the same time. Okay, so our tip number 2 then is about charging our frontal lobe. We can't really do much about the stress. We don't have a lot of control over the threat of this illness. but we do have, and so what we want to address instead is charging our frontal lobe. And so we want to be really deliberate about protecting our mental health by charging our frontal lobe. So for example, the physical distancing rules are absolutely necessary, but they're really the opposite of good mental health, right? We know that our old, bad habits are going to come out because we don't have enough frontal lobe. And rather than trying to fix the bad habits or trying to feel better or trying to feel less distressed, let's focus on recharging our frontal lobe. Okay, so we can think about this frontal lobe like a battery. And so what we're looking for is recharging activities. And recharging activities are something that make you feel more energetic at the end than when you start. And so common ones for most people include things like sleep, eating healthy food, hydrating, physical activity, and social connection. But there's also going to be individual differences in the things that make you feel charged. And so it's a bit about kind of noticing throughout your day about things where, when you're doing them or when you're done, you're kind of like, oh, I feel kind of good about that. Like, that kind of made me feel good. We're trying to watch out for some of those things. Some of them are different than in pre-COVID life, right? So I have noticed that having a shower actually is a recharging activity for me. So half of my time I am doing it from home, I'm working from home, and the other half I have to go into the hospital. And on the days when I don't have to go into the hospital, I have to consciously think about having a shower. This was not something that I had to put a lot of mental energy in before COVID living, but now all of a sudden I have to dedicate the frontal lobe to make sure I have a shower, right? This is the exhaustion of like COVID living. And so, but I've noticed that if I have a shower and get dressed and put my makeup on, that I do actually feel better. And so this is about using whatever frontal lobe I have left to engage in some of those recharging activities so that I have, a chance of having a frontal lobe that is more charged. Okay, so there's individual differences in this, and we're sort of looking for things that make you feel more energetic at the end than when you start. Now, somebody once asked, like, well, what's the difference between self-care, like recharging, versus like self-comfort? And again, it's really normal and understandable that we're doing a lot of things just to try to comfort ourselves, and that's understandable because again, it's the London bliss. I would say that a self-comforting activity is something that makes you feel good in the short term, but not necessarily in the long term. So you start out feeling good, but you don't finish feeling more energetic. And a self-care or a recharging activity is something that makes you feel more energetic at the end than when you start. So for example, when I have ice cream for dinner, I feel great in the moment, but it does not make me feel better in the long term. Okay, so these are some of my battery charges, and you'll see some regular, things that are true for most people. I now have a gym that I go to online, of course, drinking water, eating green things. I also notice that I'm having purpose, right? That's energetic. That's why I give talks like this, because I think it's a helpful, useful message for people, and it actually charges my battery to give this information to people because I know it's based on science and I know it will help people. And so that actually charges my battery. And so I'm often very grateful to have these opportunities to share this information with people. I also try to add some fun things to my battery charges, like face masks or doing my nails, because I don't normally do those kinds of things, but again, I feel like I needed like extra charges during pandemic living. And you can also see that I had to add showering to my list. So this is on my microwave because when my frontal lobe is really tired, I can't remember what my charges are. And so they have to be front and center so I can remember to do them. Okay, so our tip number 3 is about making it a routine. And our goal in making it a routine is that we will use less frontal lobe energy to make healthy choices if we've turned it into a routine. And so this is like the idea of like get up at the same time, eat the same breakfast, make the same dinner on Mondays and the same, every Monday and the same dinner every Tuesday. If you're going to have social activity, put that on a routine. Like, can we have, a virtual coffee time on Thursdays at noon? Because that way you only have to make the decision once, but you're likely to have these recharging activities in your day. Our frontal lobes are definitely more charged in the morning compared to in the evening. So I try to do things that are harder for me in the morning and things that hopefully set a good tone for my day. Okay, so this is a COVID daily schedule I found like in social media. I just want you to know this is not at all what my daily schedule looks like, not even close, okay? You wanna know what mine looks like? More like this. I have to remember to shower. I have to remember to get dressed. I have to remember to eat breakfast, right? You can see I have spinach omelet because I'm trying to reduce how much frontal lobe it takes, right? Even making the decision of what to have for breakfast, actually uses up frontal lobe to make those decisions, right? And to try and have some physical activity. So my daily schedule usually falls apart around 11 a.m., 12, because I don't have enough frontal lobe to make it through my whole day on a schedule. It uses up frontal lobe to be on a routine. And so I try to do things in the morning, and then you'll see that I try to do things also in the evenings to try to protect sleep. So we know that sleep is going to be disturbed. Again, why? Because we're in the London Blitz. Of course, your sleep's going to be disturbed. But if you have a regular time to go to bed and a regular time to wake up, you're more likely to be able to protect sleep. Those are things that are going to foster sleep to the best of our ability. We don't control whether we can go to sleep, but we can control whether we're doing things that like will foster sleep. And so, around 9:30, so in the evening, then I try to get onto my evening routine, have a wind down, do some relaxation kind of things, and then turn the lights out. Again, it uses up frontal lobe to turn your phone off. It takes frontal lobe to get off of social media or to stop reading the news. And so we're trying to reduce how much effort it takes to make those choices, like 10:30, I'm just going to shut the phone off. Okay. You want to try and start small and work your way up. And we refer to this as the 90% rule. So only set a routine that you're 90% sure that you can do. And if you're not, then make it something smaller. So just try adding a few things to your routine and just try to get those incorporated into your routine before you change anything else. So often people do this go big or go home version where they try to change everything in their lives, and we just don't have enough frontal lobe for that. So pick something small and doable you can achieve and then work your way up from that, right? It takes time to get this right. There is some trial and error involved. I was working with a patient. She was trying to get up at a regular time to protect sleep. And the next time I talked to her, she said, my husband does not want to get up at that time. So even though we had come up with a plan, when you try to put it into real life, things get in the way. And so you want to treat it like an experiment. And again, remember to include some fun things. You do not want to have like a routine that just has to-do items or should items in there. You want some things that are recharging. You can also think about going on a media diet, which means to also schedule when you're going to check in with the media. Because again, if we watch 10 different segments about COVID-19, our caveman brain doesn't say, oh, that's the same thing we just talked about 10 times. It goes, oh my gosh, there's 10 different threats out there. And so the more we are consuming this media information, the more it's making our caveman brain on fire because it's perceiving that as threat. And so it's, you still may want to check in on information. So put that on a routine as well, and just check in at various points in your day rather than consuming it all day long. And so we're trying to protect your morning routine and the evening routine, right? In the middle, I don't have much control over what happens in the middle. Why? Because I have no frontal lobe left. Okay, so I would really like, for example, to load the dishwasher in the evenings and have it run overnight, right? But it turns out I don't have enough frontal lobe for that. So even though I would like to do that in the evenings, I actually had to move that to the mornings because I did not have enough frontal lobe left to clean the kitchen at the end of the day. And so this is, again, some of these things you just need to do some trial and error to figure out what's going to work for us. Okay, so we really want to try to lower our expectations because our frontal lobes are so tired living in a COVID world. And we know that this stress affects memory, concentration, problem solving, decision making, and probably a bunch of other things that I can't remember right now. Okay, and again, why is this? Because psychologically, it's like being in the London Blitz. And so, rather than trying to be more productive or be less distressed, try to stick to a routine that charges your frontal lobe. Right? I've had to say no to a lot of things that typically I could say yes to because I don't have as much frontal lobe as I normally do. And nobody really gives me a hard time about that, but every once in a while somebody does and they kind of say, oh, why can't you get this done? And I kind of look at them and I say, I don't know if you've heard, there's this thing going on. It's a pandemic. Like, why would you even ask me why I can't get this done? There's like a pandemic going on. And this is kind of deliberate because I am trying to say to this person, this is not on me that I can't get this done. This is on you that your expectations are too high for me, right? And why? Because it's the London Blitz. Nobody ever became a fitness guru or reorganized all their closets or became a master chef during the London Blitz. So ask yourself, would I expect myself to be able to do this during the London Blitz? And if the answer is no, we're just trying to let that go. This is actually incredibly hard right now to live through all of this. Okay, our fourth tip here is about focus on what you control. And the part that we have the most control over is our behavior. And that's because it's controlled by our frontal lobe, right? Our feelings and thoughts are actually controlled by our caveman brain that functions automatically. You can't turn it off and you can't turn it on. And then we have even less control over other people's behavior and other people's thoughts and feelings. And so if we spend a lot of time focused on the things that we don't have control over, we end up feeling helpless. If you focus on the things that you do have control over, which is your own behavior, then you're more likely to feel better about that, right? So 10 years from now, if somebody says to you, what did you do during COVID-19? How are you going to answer them? And I hope that you are proud of the answer that you give. And, so for example, I've been redeployed to work with first responders and frontline providers, and that's really deeply meaningful to me, and I'm proud to be able to do that. I also know that's a really heavy job, so I have to be extra mindful about charging my battery to make sure I can keep doing that job. And also, don't underestimate or minimize the contribution of following physical distancing rules, of checking in with loved ones or checking in with people who are socially isolated. Those things make a huge impact in this. Also, having a sense of purpose, often makes us feel better. And there might be new things that can be a source of purpose now than in pre-COVID life, right? Checking in on friends or people who are socially isolated, getting groceries for people, right? Those are things that can still have a lot of meaning and purpose in the current pandemic. I, for example, have noticed that I enjoy doing laundry more than I normally do, and everyone in my household will tell you how much I try to get away from laundry. But in COVID land, I actually like laundry, and I'm pretty sure it's because it's something I can control. There's a whole bunch of things I cannot control, but I can get the laundry done, and it makes me feel accomplished. And so again, in this different world of living in COVID land, doing laundry gives me a sense of purpose. This is okay. We're trying to find things that are manageable and doable that we can do. Okay, tip number 5 is about access professional mental health support. So these are not normal times, right? The word that is used most often is unprecedented. We're in unprecedented times. And one of the unprecedented things we might need to do is to access professional mental health support. So I think everyone should have a psychologist, like you have a family doctor, but there is still some stigma attached to it. And one of the things that I hope this changes during the pandemic is our awareness of the importance of mental health and protecting mental health. These are not normal times. This is not normal coping. And so it is completely appropriate that we might need to access professional mental health support. I actually go to 2 or 3 peer support meetings with other mental health providers every week, which is like our version of accessing professional mental health support to get through this crisis, right? So there's lots of resources available for this. If you are working, there's often an EAP program that you can access confidentially. There's also provincial community health programs. So again, I will be sharing these slides, so you will be able to access them after the talk is done. Government of Canada has offered other resources, and so you can go to that website and look through a whole list of resources. There's also Wellness Together Canada, that is an online resource for mental health, Canadian Mental Health Association, and then these are provincial ones. And again, I will post these slides, or I'll give them over to be able to have them, so you don't have to write them down. You can access them after the fact. But there are ones in BC, there's ones in Alberta here, Ontario, and again, I put some for Nova Scotia. And these are all resources that you can access online now. And that includes both phone and internet. I know a lot of my patients actually don't have stable enough internet, and so we actually do it via phone. And therapy actually translates quite well online. Okay, so tip number 6 is about the only way through this is together. So I have been describing this as a war, and I think psychologically that helps us make sense of our experience. But I actually take a bit of comfort from the fact that we're actually not fighting other humans. There are other generations who did have to do these extreme kinds of things because we were fighting other humans. And I take a little bit of comfort, even though there's not a lot of comfort available in this, that we're not fighting other humans. The entire planet is facing a common enemy. And even though we've had to close borders, we're only going to succeed if we work together, right? And I think that the individuals, the companies, the countries that focus on collaboration and cooperation and contribution are the ones that are going to make it through this the most successfully. And this is a quote from Mr. Rogers about, you know, when something scary would happen, my mother would say, look for the helpers. We'll always find people who are helping. And so even though there is a lot of difficulty and tragedy, if we do this together, we're going to be a lot more successful. So we actually know this from a scientific perspective too. So they do these studies where they have people stand at the bottom of a hill and estimate how tall the hill is. And if you're standing there with a loved one, you actually think that you estimate the hill to be less tall than if you're there by yourself. Then they have studies where they have people estimate the weight of a backpack. And even though the person's not going to help you at all, if you have a loved one with you, you are likely to estimate the weight of the backpack as being less than when you're there by yourself. Then they have these other studies where they put people in a functional MRI machine and they give them a standardized shock to their toes. And you can actually watch, you know, the pain receptors in their brain light up when you give them this shock. And if you're holding the hand of a loved one, your pain receptors literally do not light up as much as when you're there by yourself. Now, if you're holding the hand of like a distressed relationship, it's actually worse than being there by yourself. So this is not a message about be with people no matter what. This is about the benefit of having a stable, secure relationship. But when we have that in our lives, you know, the obstacles don't seem as big, the burdens don't seem as heavy, and the pain doesn't seem as bad. And in this kind of context where there's really a lot of things outside of our control, feeling like we're doing it together will bring us some comfort. It doesn't take the pain away, but it adds comfort, and that makes it more bearable. Right, so this is a lovely little image that I found on social media that said, I'm afraid, said Rabbit. What are you afraid of, asked Bear. I don't know, replied Rabbit. I just am. Then I will sit with you until you're not afraid anymore, said Bear. We will face it together. This is what we're hoping for, right? Is that we're doing it together. This inherently makes us feel better. And you can be that person to other people, and we want to try to find those other people in our lives too. So my last tip here, tip number 7, is about be kind. Be kind to yourself and be kind to other people. Nobody is at their best. Nobody is at their most productive. Nobody is at their healthiest. This is a very common sentence in my household, which is, I'm sorry, I can't do that. My frontal lobe is done, right? People in my lab, my research lab will like ask me questions in the afternoon and I'll say, I don't know, I have no frontal lobe left. I can't problem solve this for you. You're gonna have to ask me in the morning when my frontal lobe is charged, right? And so we're not at our best. There's many times with my, with my kids, with my family that I'm like, I really wish I could be doing this better right now. I wish I didn't sound so irritable. I wish I was being more patient, but I don't have any frontal lobe left. And we just say this to try to lighten it. We just say this to try to be kind to each other and recognize that nobody's at their best. Why? Because it's the London Blitz, right? So again, I've done a whole bunch of tips here. There's no expectation that you're going to do all of them all at once, because that would not be a 90% goal. This is a toolbox that you can pick from to do different things that might help you out. Okay, so and this is my contact information. I have written a number of blogs about coping with COVID on the my Psychology Today, and so that's a link to the website that has a number of different resources of articles that I've written about how to cope with COVID-19. And again, these slides will be available to everybody after the fact. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. Okay, so I don't know, am I running the question and
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I was just trying to get my video going again. So thank you so much for
This
that.
is Dan as well. Sorry, I have a few questions that came in through other mediums as well, so I can ask them for you.
Great.
Or for them. The first question that we had that came in was, I am doing the best to be strong for my family, but inside I am a mess. What can you recommend I do?
Yeah, so one, this goes back to like charging your frontal lobe to try to take care of yourself, right? The other part is, I kind of bet your family would appreciate being a mess with you, right? That like my family actually doesn't like it when I'm like got it all together, because then they feel like I don't understand what they're going through. So a lot of times people will say like, I'm the rock of my family. And I'll just say, you know, it's really hard to hug a rock. I actually bet your family would really appreciate seeing your mess and recognizing that like you're struggling too, because we're all struggling. And that actually makes us feel better to know we're not the only ones struggling. And so I share like with my 10-year-old son that I'm like, I'm feeling really stressed out today. I'm feeling really anxious. And I think this is helpful for kids to see how parents manage their feelings rather than have it be some secret thing that nobody, you know, they don't know how we end up managing our feelings. And if, you know, again, I think most people should access professional mental health support also to help cope during these unprecedented times.
All right, thank you. The next question I have that came in is, I'm having quite a bit of anxiety about not being able to have access to my doctor. And I understand it, but that doesn't help my stress and anxiety. Any thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. And this is, you know, a really common comment. It's actually stressful for healthcare providers too, because they want to be providing care and they know some of those things are on hold. And there's really like not a lot of options around that. So, so again, my recommendation would be about charging your frontal lobe, because that stress and anxiety is perfectly valid, very understandable, very reasonable that those feelings are showing up. They're showing up as part of your caveman brain. And so do what you can to charge your frontal lobe just to try to manage that caveman brain. It is on fire. It's on fire for very good reasons, right? And to do things to try to protect your health, which is, you know, recharging activities are things that protect our physical and mental health.
And one other question is, in that line, I think would be the answers. Do you encourage and think it helps people to be active and to exercise?
Yeah, so for most people, physical activity is going to be a recharging activity. And again, it's something that takes a bit of effort, like it uses up some frontal lobe to do, but typically for most people, they feel more energetic at the end than when they start. And there's a variety of different ones that you can do, right? So there's things from like yoga all the way to running or weight training. And so there's a lot of different ones. There's a lot of like resources online also. So my home gym has turned into a virtual gym. You can attend live sessions with people. Our like trainers, it's like a boot camp kind of style, and our trainers still like yell at us through the videos. They like, we all turn our videos on and they tell us, you know, when we're not working hard enough. So it feels just like when we go to the, you know, gym. So there's a lot of resources online to do physical activity. And there's a range of things that might fit, again, like if you have limitations due to chronic, you know, chronic conditions or pain, that there are often other options for you. And there are some options that are lost, right? I know some of my patients like loved swimming and there's no option anymore to do that. So we're trying to be a bit creative about what else could we do to try to, again, charge our frontal lobe with some physical activity.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come in. How can I share my anxiety about being immunocompromised with others as things start to open up?
Yeah, that is a great question. And certainly some people feel reluctant about that because they don't want to share their health, you know, conditions with everybody. And in this situation, there might be times when you do have to disclose that so that you can get appropriate accommodations, right? If you know, have been working from home and your workplace is reopening, there might be accommodations that are available to you to continue to work from home if you're immune compromised and you're at greater risk. And so that does require us sometimes to disclose things to our managers or bosses to be able to get those accommodations, but they are available to most people, and most companies, you know, are supposed to abide by that and are supposed to support people who might be at greater risk to protect their health. And so it does sometimes involve a bit of disclosure, which can feel kind of uncomfortable, but it might be the only way to get the support that you need.
Thank you for that. Now I'm going to move to some questions from the current participants. One I'm picking here from Stephen Clark is asking, so COVID aside, what's your suggested strategy when your roomie discounts your mental health?
Yeah, that's really difficult. And you'll notice that in our chronic disease distress scale, one of the subcategories is about patient-provider distress, which is that sometimes our providers, you know, are so fixated on like one part of our bodies and not our overall who we are as humans. I would suggest accessing, mental health supports through other means. So you can through family doctors. You can also often self-refer to community mental health supports, and to try to find a community where people do support you and do recognize the importance of mental health. So for example, I have with my colleagues and friends, there's a little group of us that we check in on each other about our batteries like every day. We're like, how's your battery? What do you need to do to charge it? Where's it at? And that's deliberate because healthcare providers also, the culture is not about taking care of yourself. It's about putting patients first. And so it's not a culture that supports, good mental health. And so we've made this little mini culture amongst ourselves, amongst our colleagues, to like make sure we are checking in on our batteries and supporting each other and protecting our mental health.
Thank you for that. Now, could you speak a little bit more to those of us with pre-existing conditions, pre-existing mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, panic disorders? This person, Sarah, says, I'm coming out on the other side of these things, and now there's COVID. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really, common for a lot of people that, again, sometimes some of these mental health challenges that they had been addressing and maybe felt kind of stable, again, are sort of re-emerging. And that's, again, kind of what we would expect because our frontal lobes are so tired and often we can't do the coping strategies that were keeping us well. So one, again, charge your frontal lobe, work on things to take care of your frontal lobe, your physical and mental health, because that will increase the likelihood over time that you can engage in those coping strategies that were helping you. And two, it probably is a great time to access, again, professional mental health support, because we know some of these things with most of my patients, if they, had depression or anxiety, those things are coming back out again. And again, even for people who've never had any mental health conditions before, it's a stressful time where these things are emerging also, because again, it's the London Blitz. And so, that's really my two take-home messages for everybody is one, charge your frontal lobe, and two, access professional mental health support.
Great, thank you for that. Now, this question is in regards to frontal lobe, and I think is fitting here. There's a question from Taggers, one of the participants, is asking, suppressing pain seems to take a lot of brain power. I have trained my brain to ignore the pain, but it still takes its mental toll and leaves me exhausted at the end of the day. Is that the frontal lobe battery?
Yeah, so the pain is a great question. The pain is coming from your caveman brain. That is where we register pain. And again, that's like exactly what you'd expect a survival brain to do. Our survival brain, again, was designed or like adapted for a time when our life expectancy was 30. And so when we had pain, it was usually an acute illness, and it usually was associated with death, right? It was like something really, you've broken your leg. And if you've broken your leg, like one of the best things to do is to rest. And that's what those pain, signals tell us, is they want us to rest. And if you have an acute injury, that's usually great advice. When we have chronic pain, sometimes that makes it worse, right? Sometimes we need to stay mobile to be able to protect our functioning, even though our caveman brain is screaming at us saying, no, 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 you need to rest. And so yes, your caveman brain is on fire if you have chronic pain. And it is like sending you these signals that feel like they're really like, they're coming from your survival brain. And so it absolutely does use up frontal lobe to cope with that caveman brain that's on fire from chronic pain. And so this is, again, that sometimes we can't do as much as we want to because part of that frontal lobe is being spent on managing chronic pain. And that is one of the crappiest parts about having chronic pain, is acknowledging that sometimes we can't do all the things we want to do because of those limitations. But the more we set expectations around what we can actually handle, then the more likely you will be successful at most of those things. And sometimes it comes down to prioritizing what really matters to you. And if I only have a certain amount of frontal lobe left, what do I want to spend it on? And that's things that I've had to do also during the COVID pandemic about, I'm not gonna be able to say yes to all the things I normally say yes to. So what's most important to me? Where am I gonna spend my frontal lobe? Because it's not unlimited. It's not unlimited for anyone. And right now it's especially, taxed. And if you have chronic pain, your frontal lobe is being taxed a lot for dealing with chronic pain.
Great, thank you for that, doctor. Now I have another question here from an anonymous attendee who's a participant. They say, I feel that I'm able to manage my anxiety somewhat well during the day, but it overwhelms my nights. I have regular sleep disruption complicated by bodily pain at night and highly anxious dreams. Could you relate your advice about frontal lobe recharging to sleep and dreams? Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, so we actually know that having vivid dreams is a thing during the pandemic, and it's because our sleep is more disrupted. Why? Because it's the London Blitz. Of course, our sleep would be disrupted. And when we have disrupted sleep, we're more likely to remember our dreams when we wake up. So if you have a really deep sleep, you're less likely to remember your dreams. And most of us, our sleep is disturbed, and so we're more likely to remember our dreams. It is also a very common thing that we can manage our anxiety and worry during the day. And then at night, when we're calm and there's nothing else to kind of distract us, then it comes like roaring back. So there are, some things that you can do. Again, having a regular sleep schedule, so waking up at the same time, trying to go to bed at the same time, learning some relaxation or mindfulness daytime, and practicing them during the daytime, you can eventually be able to use those at nighttime to try to calm down your caveman brain with all the anxiety to be able to either fall asleep or go back to sleep. Lots of people hate taking medication, and I understand that, but there may also be a benefit of using some sleep medication because we know that sleep deprivation isn't good for you either. So people think about like, should I take medication or not take medication? Well, if that's your choice, then don't take medication. But it's take medication or like have sleep deprivation, which isn't good for us either. And so sometimes this may be an appropriate time to take some sleep medication to help us get some rest, because we know that that's a big factor in our frontal lobe and how well we can cope with that. Also, people often find that like having a little bit of worry time, so early in your day, not right before you go to bed, but maybe like dinner time or lunchtime, spending a few minutes writing down the things that you're worried about. Because the act of writing it down, when you wake up in the middle of the night or when you're lying in bed and your mind starts racing, you can actually say to your mind, it's okay, I have it on the list. We can deal with this tomorrow. Because sometimes those racing thoughts are about, oh, I need to remind you this is really important. Oh, we have to worry about this. Oh, we have to remember about this. And so sometimes writing it down earlier in the day will allow you to let those thoughts go, because you can tell your mind, it's okay, I have it written down on a list. We can deal with it tomorrow. And the other thing that our anxious brains often do to us is they want us to problem solve like 100 steps ahead. So I noticed myself problem solving what I was going to do when my kid has to go back to school, which isn't happening until September, right? And the problem with problem solving 100 steps ahead is we don't have enough data to effectively problem solve. So our anxiety mind tricks us into thinking if you just plan enough, everything will be okay. You won't feel anxious. But it's not true, because when you're problem solving that far in the future, we actually don't have enough information. And so we end up problem solving like 10 different versions of the future, right? Well, if this happens, I could do this. If that happens, then I'll do this. And that actually does feel overwhelming, because only one of those is going to happen, but we're busy problem solving 10 different options of what might happen. So if you're problem solving 100 steps ahead, and again, it's really normal right now because our caveman brains are on fire, come back to the present moment and just problem solve the next step. And sometimes the next step is, what am I going to have for lunch, right? Sometimes it is not a big thing. It's about, what can I do to recharge my battery today, right now?
Thank you for that. Another question I have here from Beverly. She says, good evening. Can you elaborate about the tip number 4? What is your point of view related to focus on your own behavior? How do you explain this for a patient?
Yeah, so the idea of focusing on our own behavior is that that's the part we have the most control over, right? Our caveman brain is where our feelings and thoughts come from. So if we're trying to not feel anxious or don't think about bad things, that's coming from part of our brain we don't have control over. And eventually that will get us into trouble. If you focus on your behavior, which is what other people can see you do, you're gonna feel more in control because you're focused on something you actually have control over. I think a great example of this is like when friends and family are not following like physical distancing rules and the stress about that. And, if you've never said anything to them, then sure, definitely, let them know that they should be following physical distancing rules. But in my experience, people right now who aren't following those rules, it's either because their caveman brain is on fire or their frontal lobe is so tired that they can't follow the rule. And that maybe under better circumstances, they might be able to follow the rule, but they really can't do that right now. And it's probably an old school coping strategy for them on some level that they just can't manage because they don't have enough frontal lobe. So it'll make you feel really like helpless if you're focused on what other people are doing. So if you focus instead, and this is like, you know, one of those things you have to keep refocusing on your own behavior. Am I doing the things I think I should? Am I taking care of myself? Am I recharging my own battery? Am I following the physical distancing rules? And you'll end up feeling more in control overall if you focus on your own behavior.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. I have one here from Seti and Masurdi. Hi, my infusion was postponed by my doctor for 6 weeks because of the high risk of contamination and risk management. So my doctor reached out and I'll get my infusion tomorrow. I'm happy to get back my biological because I'm suffering from a high level of pain, but also I feel very anxious about the risk of getting COVID-19. What is your advice to help with going back to the health system to get the testing and treatment? Thanks for your presentation, Seti.
Yeah, so I understand that stress. Every time I have to go into my office at the hospital, I feel that stress too. And for me personally, it's more about whether I might infect somebody else at the hospital or whether I might bring it home to my family. But this is a very understandable sense of distress about this. And this is your caveman mind warning you about a risk. It's very normal and understandable that your caveman mind is warning you about this. Again, charge your frontal lobe, because if you have a charged frontal lobe, you're going to be able to follow the protocols that will be the best to keep you safe, right? So there'll be all kinds of things about masks and washing your hands and all these things that, you know, hospitals actually do quite well. These infection control procedures are not new things. We've been doing them for decades, right? I've been in PPEs way before COVID happened. And so these infection control protocols work very well. Hospital people know exactly how to do them. It's not new science for them, not new behaviors for them. If you have a charged frontal lobe, you're going to be better able at following those procedures that will help to keep you safe. And the hospital staff are definitely, I mean, it's both stressful when your procedure gets delayed, but it's also a relief to know that they're only going to do things when it's safe, right? And that's why they're reopening things. That's why they're opening clinics, is because they have deemed it safe enough that they can have people that they know have compromised immune systems, right, to provide care. And so they'll have a whole bunch of protocols to follow. Charge your frontal lobe, make sure you've had breakfast and you're hydrated and you've done all of those things, because that will help you follow the protocols that you're supposed to when you're there.
Thank you. Now I have another question here from an anonymous attendee. My FAP for counseling has already exceeded this year. What other options do I have?
Yep, so often people, have used up their benefits, or they had, and so I'm guessing that's the question, is I've used up my benefits for mental health support, what can I do instead? So if you have a company, often EAP programs will have and they sometimes are offering extra sessions during the COVID crisis. But there's also community mental health, which is available for everybody. It's free, it's a public service. They have a lot of new programming available online because of the crisis that you can access. And so I would suggest, going to some of those websites and looking for some of that information around how you can access professional mental health support. There actually is a lot of resources right now, which I think is one of the things I hope sticks around after COVID, is this focus on community, on the importance of mental health. But there are a lot of free resources you can access nowadays, and all of them online.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have one more question and I'm going to hand it over to Graham. Do you have any suggestions on how to tell people that you need them to respect your limitations? I get the impression that people feel I'm paranoid when I insist on proper physical distancing.
I know, I understand. And, I'm physically distancing with my sister and my son. And so we're all living together. And as a medical person, I have that same heightened level of no, you have to follow the rules and you have to do the physical distancing. And we're all wearing masks when we leave the house and hand sanitize again and again, right? And so I understand that desire and that need to do that. I think our best bet is, I think our best bet is to be direct about hey, if you wouldn't mind, I'd really appreciate it if you could follow the physical distancing rules. If it's somebody that you work with a lot or you interact with a lot and they keep breaking the rules, you might just want to be curious about that. you know, because I don't think they mean to put you at risk. I don't think they're trying to do something harmful. My guess is, again, that either their caveman brain's on fire or their frontal lobe is so taxed that they can't remember to follow the rules. So some of my coworkers, for example, who keep taking their masks off when they're not supposed to, I will say to them, like, you know what, I actually, you know, think that you want to be following the rules. And I'm guessing that maybe you just kind of forget, or it's uncomfortable or something. And I'm just wondering if you and me could agree that we could remind each other if we're forgetting to do one of those things. Would that be okay if we could just kind of remind each other? Because I know that you actually, you know, I don't think you want to put anybody at risk, and I don't want to put anyone at risk. Do you think we could do that for each other? That's kind of for someone that you see often, which is that it's probably that their frontal lobe is too tired to remember to follow the rules. And sometimes it actually does require us to disclose that we have a health condition for people to really get it. And even though that might feel really uncomfortable to disclose that to people, sometimes that is the only way that they get it, is because they understand that, you know, you're not just sort of being paranoid, that this has a different implication for you if you have an underlying health condition. And again, I think most people respect that and understand that and don't want to harm other people.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lee-Baggley. Graham, it's your turn. I think you're on mute, but you're ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Doctor, and thanks for all the incredible questions. It's been a real pleasure sharing this space with you, and I recognize that you know, that there are remaining questions, and so maybe we can chat after the webinar to figure out whether there's a strategy to respond to those other questions. I'll note some of them relate to physical activity, and we will approach that next week in the webinar. On Tuesday, we'll have a physiotherapist from Toronto that will help kind of understand how do we stay active in a safe way. So with that, I want to appreciate you taking this time, Dr. Lee-Baggley. Appreciate the candor that I think many people in the chat recognized, and really appreciate you know, you sharing your vulnerabilities and us sharing ours. And I think this is an important conversation that I hope continues past the COVID crisis, and acknowledging, you know, that we are people with multiple identities and we have multiple intersecting vulnerabilities. And, you know, hopefully we'll be able to kind of demolish those kind of personal professional silos. So Shimigwich for that. And maybe I'll turn it over to you for any just final comments before we close this webinar.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. And again, you know, if you're wondering, you know, if you're being hard on yourself, just remember that the doctor who gave all the expert is trying to remember to shower every day. Okay, just remember that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we do have this recorded, and we'll make sure to circulate the slide decks that everybody has access to, those resources that were shared. And we look forward to having you here next week as we talk about COVID and kind of the situation that those living with spondyloarthritis are in. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lee-Baggley. Thank you, Dan and Wendy, for organizing this, and we'll look forward to continuing these conversations.
Thank you, and take care.
Bye, everyone.